Senator. So Senator Roberts, you have the call.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for attending tonight. First of all, what's clean energy?
Senator, as the Clean Energy Regulator, we have a range of legislation that we're entrusted to administer, and the relevant bits of clean energy are defined in that legislation.
So what are they?
Oh, there's a range. Shailene, would you like to have a go at that?
Shailene Thompson, Executive General Manager, Scheme Operations Division. So, Senator, as part of our administration of various legislative schemes, we are entrusted with looking after the two aspects of the renewable energy target, which includes the large-scale renewable energy target and the smaller-scale target. And I believe the eligible technologies under that Act include solar PV, wind power. I think there's some biomethane in there as well. So those things are essentially eligible activities or technologies that attract the incentive provided by the renewable energy target.
So
there's one other, which is heat pump hot water.
That's right. Yes.
Sorry, what was that?
Heat pump hot water. So the new hot water systems, rather than having electricity go through a resistive heater or a gas heater, you have a heat pump on it. So it's like a reverse air conditioner, which puts heat into the water. They're more efficient, use less electricity.
So what's defined as clean is defined in the regulations which you have to enforce?
Well, for our purposes, yes.
Yeah, okay. The purpose of the agency is listed as being accelerating carbon abatement for Australia. I think that means carbon dioxide. Any such goal must be tempered by the costs this entails. The regulator administers a range of programs, including the Emissions Reduction Fund, the Renewable Energy Target, and the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme. The regulator has a budget of about 75 million. Is that about right?
That's about right, yep.
So it's generally recognised that the costs imposed on business by regulations is considerably in excess of the direct costs of the regulator itself, so more than your 75 million. Have you estimated the costs of compliance by businesses as required by the government's regulation review guidelines?
Well, in terms of our existing regulation, no, we haven't done a survey, but let me say, as a matter of culture, we take it as one of our duties to reduce the cost impact of the legislation that we administer, and I think it would be fair to say that we have a good record in that space.
How do you do that, and what kind of examples can you give me?
Yeah, okay, so I can give you a range of examples. So let me take one in the small-scale renewable energy space.
Small scale?
Small scale, so this is solar panels on roofs, for example. When that scheme was originally conceived, it involved people filling out lots of forms, the forms sort of shooting all over the place and eventually winding up at the regulator. Then we'd have people look at the forms. That would take some time. Obviously, filling in forms and moving information around the various parties in the industry would have a cost. As one of the innovations that was sort of co-developed with industry, we now have a process called the solar panel validation arrangements. I won't go into all of the details because that would take some time, but broadly speaking, what it means is that the installer takes out their telephone. There's an app on that telephone. They take a photo of the panels, where they're being installed, before and after, so you can see that it's been done. That's an anti-fraud measure. Takes a photograph of the relevant barcodes on the panel, so we know what panels are there. And then essentially you press submit, information so it goes through the network, the web, to the various people involved, and it quickly ends up in our shop for the purposes of validating the install and providing the renewable energy certificates. That data essentially just goes directly into our systems and doesn't require very much human intervention at all. And so that reduces the time taken to do this. And I could give you a range of other suggestions like that, Senator.
So a new scheme is coming in, the Corporate Emissions Reduction Transparency Report.
Yep.
And it seeks to gather and codify information from all companies rather than the 2,500 presently covered in the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme. The scheme was open to public comment until 19th of March 2021 in a government media release of 19 February. Now, 28 days seems a bit short. Was this part of the regulation impact statement procedure required by the government? And have you estimated the paper burden costs of the scheme?
Well, let me just correct some of the facts that you've stated. It's not a requirement to all companies. It's a requirement to for us to set up a framework, which we've done. It's a voluntary arrangement.
It's an opt-in.
It's an opt-in.
Strictly speaking, it's an opt-in.
Well, whether you call it strictly speaking or want to go to the issues about companies would want to opt in and why, it's formally an opt-in arrangement.
So is the scheme proceeding?
The scheme is still in the process of development. You told quickly the story of the proposal being put out for consultation. We've got quite a substantial amount of feedback from industry about that. In essence, if you like, the scheme is about moving reporting from, and this is itself a simplification, moving reporting under the cert process to the extent that companies opt in, moving that from gross emissions, which is the arrangement under the so-called NGERS reporting, National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting System, over to a net story if companies wish to opt in, and companies as part of that will be able to tell their story about how they're proposing to reduce their net emissions position.
So when you talk about emissions, you're talking about carbon dioxide
Yes.
output? Okay. Not sulphur?
Or equivalent. Yeah.
Sorry?
Or equivalent.
Okay, methane. You're not talking about nitrous oxide, sulphur dioxide, particulates, or any of the real pollutants?
Well, nitrous oxide is a relevant gas that's covered. So anything that's covered, okay. Yeah.
So it covers real pollutants too. Now it is an opt-in program, as you said. Yet it's likely, it seems, that green activist organisations will use it to target those companies that initially choose to opt out. Not opt in.
Look, I think that remains to be seen. I wouldn't speculate on how it will be used, who might opt in at this stage. I mean, it's very early in the process. I mean, it's quite clear that the way climate change issues are being thought about has moved quite clearly into the net space as opposed to the gross space. And so what this report does is intended to align with that shift.
Okay. Can you offer...
Roberts, again, I'd like to hand the call over to Senator
Can I
Daisy soon. So yes, ask two more questions if you like, then we'll pass it over.
Can you offer information regarding the compliance costs for business?
Well, look, it's difficult to say. I mean, it will depend on how a company chooses to opt in, on what basis, whether that's an equity basis or a basis that comes directly out of the NGERS arrangement. So it's one of these things which is quite difficult to say at this point in time.
Well, last question. If the large-scale renewable energy target has been achieved, and I'm told that we have achieved it, why is there a positive price to the renewable energy target subsidy target itself, when any such price is possible only if the regulatory measures are in place requiring retailers incorporate this energy in their supplies? So if we've already achieved it, why are we driving more subsidies to achieve even more?
Well, the price of large-scale generation certificates, let's just focus on that for the purposes of discussing the question. So the legislation sets a statutory target of 33,000 gigawatt hours, and a couple of things to observe. So there was a statutory target through time, but also a mechanism embedded in the legislation to permit, in technical terms, arbitration. Not arbitration, it's not the word, but arbitrage between the years, pardon me. And there is still some obligation that remains to be met should a company wish to. Right? They've taken so-called the so-called default arrangement out of that. They could redeem those payments for certificates. So there's some sort of old demand. And the other point is that that target is not the only demand that's there in the market. So it's possible for people to voluntarily surrender certificates if they wish. And there are some schemes which also connect into the scheme, such as green power, where if people wish, they can sort of tick the box. I'm using that term somewhat pejoratively, but choose to purchase low emissions energy from their energy retailers, and I won't go into all the details, but that also flows through into an LGC demand on top of the statutory target. So prices are heading down. We expect them to head down further, but in terms of where they go over time, so as some of those things that I've explained work themselves out. Where the price heads over time, there's a range of views about that.
Thank you. Thank you.